So I want to start here with the so what questions that I got out of the second part of this chapter, and that we'll go through in various ways. But I just wanted to preface this before we get into the material with some big questions that this alerts us to in our society. And one of the questions that comes up at the end of this section, beyond where I told you to read carefully, but it's worth a look anyway, is how we define freedom. And especially in the context in which some people have a lot more wealth and power than others in our own society and around the world, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to have liberty? How should we define what it means to be free when some people seem to have so much control over others? This is a very lively political issue. There are many people who want to claim the mantle of freedom, but you got to watch out for them because they might take it away in some other aspect. The second part that I think is hugely important and will become more important is important as we go along, but really comes up here, is that we need to take seriously what indigenous peoples and indigenous intellectuals, indigenous theorists tell us. And this is something that anthropology has done probably better than many other disciplines. Not always, but probably better. But I think it is increasingly important as we look at the issues that we are facing around the world. And interestingly, the people who are classified as indigenous, and some people thought were going to disappear, probably back in the time when the Europeans were exploring, they thought they were going to bulldoze over everyone who identified as indigenous, they have become increasingly actually important to our politics, our climate issues, climate change, the state of the world. So we need to be careful of any kind of criticisms that would minimize the ideas of indigenous peoples, because we need to take that seriously. And the third part of it is understanding this idea that there was these stages of economic development, which is still something that despite decades of trying to critique or trying to understand or qualify, it's still something that it underlies our ideas about how the world works. And we may not know it, but you don't have to look too far, and people will assume that hunters become herders, become farmers, become civilized people. So we'll go through that. So these are the three kind of big questions that I want to focus on. I asked you in your web comment to try to have an argument or a conversation with the indigenous Kandiaronk. A couple people took me up on that. A couple people kind of skirted the edges of trying to actually have that conversation. But we did well enough. So we'll proceed. I want to actually start with something that is in this chapter a little bit of an aside for them, but will come up again throughout the book and relates to our first issue of political freedom. And it's the idea of schismogenesis, which was first proposed as a terminology, maybe not as an idea, but the terminology goes back to around 1936, 1937 with Gregory Bateson, developed in his book called Navan, one of the longest subtitles ever. The culture of the Atmo people of New Guinea is revealed through a study of the Navan ceremony. It's a really interesting book, and Bateson is an interesting character. For those who were with me in cultural anthropology last semester, he was married to Margaret Mead for a while, but then kind of did his own thing. Anyway, schismogenesis, basically, how does change or rupture develop? And in Bateson's idea, one of the things that can happen is that you start off with these small, a small division, a kind of a small difference between people. But as you start talking and as you start arguing, you exaggerate your argument to the point that that person becomes the opposite of what you believe. And we can see this in our political situation in some ways. What might have begun as two political positions which are not too far away from each other. I mean, it used to be said of the United States, for example, that the Democrats and the Republicans, if you put them in a European context or in the context of another country, were basically two versions of a fairly conservative party. There really wasn't a left-wing alternative. So on the one hand, you could say that the Democrats and the Republicans were never very far apart. And that's why we had political candidates come in and try and be third-party candidates like the Green Party or other third-party movements, because the idea was Democrats and Republicans aren't so far apart. But I think that we can probably agree that nowadays we believe, or diehards believe, that we are completely different, completely apart, that we live in almost entirely different realms of reality. And whether we agree with that or not, with that assessment or not, Bateson's idea of schismogenesis helps us understand how such divisions can come about, starting with a small thing, from a small position of difference and evolving as people argue with each other into a point at which then they're convinced that the other person is the exact opposite of them. And certainly this happens with the idea of freedom. So we have some people who claim that they are the advocates of freedom and that they're going to drive around in big vehicles with big flags flying, and they're not going to do anything that anybody tells them to do, like wear a mask. So we have people who are claiming to be freedom on one side, but then those very same people turn around and say, well, yes, but in terms of restrictions over what a woman should be able to do with her body, that's fine. Or what people should be able to read or write or teach in school, all for that. So then you have this other idea of freedom, which is, well, do I have autonomy over my body, what I can do or not? So we get into all kinds, they talk about various definitions of what it means to be free, equal, liberty, those kinds of things, because they have a lot of different nuances to them. So this is a concept that we can use to analyze different political positions, different ethnic groups and ethnic conflicts, for example, how these develop. And it will come up later in the book, but I would just want to highlight it here as a way of thinking about these larger political issues. The second issue is trying to take the indigenous critiques seriously. Ideas of, I'm probably not going to do very well with pronunciations here, but we'll just say Kandiaronk. In Lahontan's book, Dialogues with the Savage, a very good sense, he is named as Adaria. And over the years, many people have believed that Lahontan basically made this up, that he made up these dialogues so that he could criticize European society without being thrown in jail for it. And so he made up these dialogues, and that there, although there was a real Kandiaronk, he could not have possibly have known so much about European society and been able to say so much about it. Graeber and Wengrow claimed that basically that Kandiaronk was a very skilled debater. We knew that he actually probably did visit France, and that he was known for being able to outwit Europeans at every turn, and that Lahontan had a long experience in this area And so they say it is real. And there's been some debate. Graeber and Wengrow have been criticized for saying that Kandiaronk's arguments were, basically represented in this book. They draw for their own analysis on an indigenous intellectual named Barbara Horace Mann, and she claims that, yeah, this is probably pretty accurate. Sure, there were differences in translation and all those things, but it probably represents what kinds of ideas Kandiaronk was saying. And there are other scholars who say, well, yeah, sure, Lahontan put some gloss on it and did his own thing with it, but you can still see glimpses or things that would have come out of the Indigenous critique itself. There's a review of this book that says that Graeber and Wengrow are fools for even thinking this was real, and this is a stupid argument, and criticizes Mann as well, Barbara Horace Mann. And I find that argument a little bit over the top. And like I said, I think it is important to listen to Indigenous scholars on this. And it's weird that the critic compares this to, say, Gulliver's Travels, because we know most of the people that Lahontan was talking about were indeed real people. So we're not, though, going to care too much about the reality of this. What I want you to do was just try to engage with the argument itself and see if you agreed or disagreed with what Kandiaronk, if that was his argument, says. Now, for a long time, I couldn't get anybody to talk about the religion argument. I thought maybe you were too afraid to embrace this argument, or maybe everybody just believes this now. It's so obvious that it's like, of course. And then, Matthew, what happened? What do you think? What does Kandiaronk say about Christianity as compared to other religions?
I have my own opinion on religion. I think he makes a decent point in saying that, there's all these branches of Christianity, yet they're saying if you don't, follow the branch that they believe in exactly, that you're in the wrong, and that, you're not following the faith right. But when there's so many different ones, it's like, all right, so who's, not doing the right thing? Like, I don't know, it gets like to be too much, where, if it's a whole separate religion, I understand a whole separate set of beliefs and all that, but when it's within the same religion, it's just hard to comprehend.
Yeah, so you quoted this part, that Kandiaronk continually emphasized the fact that Christians are divided into endless sects, factions, right? Each convinced they are entirely right and that all the others are hellbound. Which at the time, I mean, this is around the time that, people are like burning people at the stake for whether or not the Eucharist was the true body of Christ or not, right? I mean, it's a little different nowadays. It's a little different. People don't get so excited about small doctrinal differences, but at the time people were pretty convinced of this. It's a little different these days. I remember growing up among a pretty radical Protestant sect, and we really didn't believe the Catholics were going to heaven. They were way off, man. So, I mean, we were kind of old-fashioned, I guess we'd say. But in today's world, yeah, probably even Catholics and Protestants are getting along better than they used to. What would Kandiaronk say, though, about religion? The Christian, even if the Christians were getting along, he actually had this to say. This is on same page 53. For myself, I've always held that if it were possible that God had lowered his standards sufficiently to come down to earth, he would have done it in full view of everyone, descending in triumph with pomp and majesty and most publicly. So basically, he's objecting to the idea that Jesus comes down as a humble God comes down as Jesus to be born in a manger in one little part of the world and doesn't even tell anybody about it. He would have gone from nation to nation, performing mighty miracles, thus giving everyone the same laws. Then we would all have had exactly the same religion, uniformly spread and equally known throughout the four corners of the world, proving to our descendants from then till 10,000 years into the future the truth of this religion. He's saying, right, is that if Christians were right, God should have come down and, you know, done some good stuff, gone everywhere, told everybody about it, and then we'd all get the choice to accept it or not. Instead, there are 500 or 600 religions, each distinct from the other, of which, according to you, the religion of the French alone is any good, sainted, or true. So it is a puzzle in Christianity, at least when I was growing up. You know, we were told that everybody who didn't accept Jesus Christ as their personal savior was going to hell. But what do you do with all the people who never even heard about that? Why, that's why you had to go send all those missionaries off to at least tell them about it. But, you know, it was a little bit of a doctrinal issue. Can I get anybody to agree or disagree with Kandiaronk on this one? What would you say? Gabe. You just agree. Yeah, I think this is, I don't know, this kind of becomes standard now, right? In some ways. I don't know if anybody is condemning it. If anybody's going to condemn all non-believers to hell, even if they haven't heard about it. It's a pretty extreme position, I guess, these days. So, yeah, maybe we just all agree. All right. Yeah, if we're advanced anthropology students, we probably agree. All right, religion, we all agree. On the legal system. So, what's next, Felicia? What does he have to say about the legal system and the laws that the Europeans have?
It was saying the European, he criticized the fixation with private property and the traditional laws. And it was also saying like the social system is based on the concept of like property and money, which give rise to the use.
Yeah. So Kandiaronk is saying that you don't need punitive laws. He says that we don't even have them. And they say, well, he's not talking, it's not that the Iroquois didn't have it's not that they didn't have or the Wendat didn't have a legal system. They did have a legal code, but they didn't have coercive laws that could be enforced by punishment, as we talked about, I think, in the last class. If someone did something wrong, then your kin or your clan or your group had to pay for it, but you yourself might get off free. So you don't need punitive laws. Gabe is the one I counted on to actually see if he agreed or disagreed. What do you think, Gabe? Do we need punitive laws? In a perfect world, no. So yes, we probably do, because hey, we have them. But Lahontan makes up this, or has the dialogue that he says, you know, we'd be miserable if we weren't able to punish those murderers and robbers, right? And Kandiaronk says, for my own part, I find it hard to see how you could be much more miserable than you already are. What kind of human, what species of creature must Europeans be that they have to be forced to do good and only refrain from evil because of fear of punishment? Right? So he's saying, hey, this is ridiculous. You guys are already miserable. You have all these murderers and robbers in your society. You're already in a miserable state of existence. And the only thing that the only thing that keeps people in line, apparently, is that they're afraid of being punished. You can't just call upon people's, goodness of heart. You have to threaten them. So I think, Gabe, if I read you correctly, you agreed with this as well. Yeah, he's a very convincing guy, that Kandiaronk. And then there was, as Felicia has described, the idea of wealth. And I think, Liz, you talked about this a little bit too. What's the fundamental problem that Kandiaronk sees in European societies? Okay, yeah, good. I think this is a fundamental disagreement, that it's not that necessarily that the Wendat, that his society didn't have wealth differences or that they didn't have power differences, but there wasn't such an easy translation of wealth into power over others, to making them able to do what they want to do. And he takes it back to the laws, and he says, hey, the reason you have punitive laws is because you have this all other system which is encouraging people to be selfish and acquisitive and get things, and get wealth and want things. And you can see here actually kind of the basis that we've talked about of European society, which is, on the one hand, if you believe that everyone is naturally selfish and naturally acquisitive and competitive and in a state of cutthroat competition, then you need the state, the Leviathan, the government, to keep people under control, to regulate that war of all against all. And you need punitive laws, you need to lock people up, and you need to keep the murderers and the criminals out of your life because they're bad. And so you have the state and you have the legal system to regulate all of that. That's why Hobbes wants you to have a strong state. And if we don't, we'd be in a state of nature which is nasty, brutish, and short. Now, as we mentioned in the last, maybe 2 classes ago, in terms of the economic sphere, that other sphere in which people are trying to get as much wealth and goods as they can, or at least a decent living, Adam Smith tells us that that's going to work out fine in a competitive market. I'm baking bread and you're building a house, and I trade you this for that by means of money, that as long as we're all doing our thing, as long as we're all following our self-interest, at the market, the economic competition is going to work that out because of the invisible hand, which is going to, you don't necessarily, obviously you need a number of economic guidelines, but that's the way the competition gets worked out. So again, though, Lahontan's critique of this is very powerful. And as you might imagine, it was a very powerful criticism for people from below, or Europeans who were interested in thinking about a different way to run a highly unequal society. And this is where Graeber and Wengrow say that, yes, Kandiaronk was the real deal, that was really what the Indigenous critique was. But after that, almost everybody kind of did their version of Kandiaronk, which a lot of people basically either copied it or made something up. And one of the most famous examples of that was a novel called Letters of a Peruvian Woman by Francois de Graffigny. I had never heard of this novel before, but apparently it was one of the best sellers of the 17th century. It was written by a woman. It was different than many of the things that they had. The person who was a Peruvian woman in this account was probably almost entirely made up. And what the author was saying is that it was basically following the Indigenous critique of European societies, but saying that the Inca had a kind of redistributive socialist state, and that everything was better under that system. So this became, again, even if you weren't familiar with Lahontan's work, this would have been one of the best-selling novels of the time, and the idea that the Peruvian or the Inca state was actually a socialist paradise. Now, what Graeber and Wengrow say is that this person named Turgot, Turgot, wrote a letter to the author of this book and said, you know, this book is wrong because the problem is that everybody is equal. They're equal in their poverty. And so he wanted the person to come to this realization. And instead, she obviously did not follow his advice, but he later would, a few years after that, would come up, and this is in, like I said, in the 18th century. Oh, I should say that novel was one of the best-selling books of the 18th century, so around 1750s or so. He comes up with the idea that people start off in a stage of hunting, and that leads into a stage of herding or pastoralism, and then they evolve into a stage of farming, and then they evolve into a stage of commerce or industry. And apparently he was a good buddy with Adam Smith. And if you read The Wealth of Nations and the whole, where we talked about the invisible hand and how market competition helps regulate things, you will see in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations this very idea of a progression from starting as hunters and moving on to herders, moving on to farmers, moving on to civilization or commerce. And it's a very strong idea that has had huge implications for how we think about the world. And apparently it started back as a response to the Indigenous Critique by Trugo, who then helped Adam Smith and others develop this idea. It's such a strong thing that it actually underlies a lot of what people's ideas they have before they come into anthropology about the development of domestication in these things. So I think only a couple of you took intro with me, but in Intro to Anthropology, what I do is I tell people what we used to think about society. We had this progression from man the hunter, who would become man the herder, who became man the farmer, and who became civilized man. And in my class, I tried to then revise ideas of, obviously this is one centered on man. And so we try to revise ideas and talk about gathering and hunting and pastoralism and horticulture and agriculture. We revised the order because it probably there was that horticulture came before herding. And we revised the idea that this is some sort of progressive line that leads up and up and up. And in Intro to Anthropology, I introduce you to the revisionist critique as embodied by Jared Diamond's worst mistake in the history of the human race, which basically claims that agriculture was the downfall of humanity, not the up thing of humanity. And in the very old days, I would then play them a section of AC/DC's Highway to Hell at high volume to emphasize how much Jared Diamond was talking about agriculture as a highway to hell. Then I got in trouble for that because somebody in the next room was taking an exam, and so they came over and got mad at me for playing loud guitar solo. I know it wasn't your class, pre-COVID. So, you know, but I guess I would say that in all of my years of trying to help people rethink this, it's been extremely durable. It's very difficult to dislodge this. When I'm reading Graeber and Wengrow now, I now realize that this is what I should say. It's more like this. First, there was Hobbes, with the idea that people in a state of nature were nasty, brutish, and short, and that we needed a state government to bring us out of the war of all against all, and that produced progress. Then, of course, against Hobbesian ideas, you have Rousseau in the Indigenous Critique, which says, no, we were once in this elevated state of equality and liberty and freedom, and agriculture has been the downfall, and private property is the downfall. But as a response to the Indigenous Critique and Rousseau, that's where the economic stages come in, where you have man the hunter, man the herder, man the farmer, saying, okay, well, fine, there's inequality in this situation, but that's how we got civilization, don't you know? Now, this becomes very durable and holds on from Adam Smith's time, 1776 or so, up until the 1960s, when then you have the archaeologists with their revisionist critique coming in and saying, no, actually, people in hunter and gatherer societies only had to work 10 to 15 hours a week, and life wasn't massively brutish and short. And you have Jared Diamond coming in. And then as a response to that, of course, you have Steven Pinker coming in and saying, nah, everything's great now. Enlightenment, reason, progress, science. This is why violence has declined. We're drawing on the better angels of our nature. Now, my whole point in this is not that we need to study the history of this, but you notice that everybody is just going back and forth between basically the egalitarian, hey, everything is getting better. I mean, no, everything's getting worse. We once lived in egalitarian societies, but now everything is bad, or everything was bad and we need hierarchy and we need these kinds of things in order to be better and better. And so people just flip-flop between these two very deterministic positions. In the next chapter, we will read about a different way of thinking about societies that doesn't just flip-flop between egalitarian and hierarchy. So that is what we'll do. Before we do that, though, we'll just briefly touch on the last section of this chapter, which I said don't worry about too much, because it gets into some heavy-duty intellectual history back and forth. But the big point, I think, is worth thinking about. What they say here is that the problem with what Rousseau is doing is not necessarily that he invented, which technically he didn't, the idea of the noble savage, but, well, Decurzio, that's your point or your quote. What is the problem here? It's not the noble savage. What's the problem that they're trying to argue against? That that they're not stupid. Yeah. So they really are down on Rousseau, that's somebody else, for coming up with the idea of this stupid savage that basically, in comparison to some of the other people who were thinking about this at the time, at least in Lahontan's dialogues or with the letters from a Peruvian woman, they may be real, they may be made up, but at least with those accounts, the indigenous people have something to say. They're talking. Maybe they're not real, but at least people are saying, hey, we can have a dialogue or an encounter with indigenous societies, and they can teach us something about our own society. In Rousseau and others, basically, what Graeber and Wengrow are saying is that it becomes the idea that indigenous people don't even think about or talk about different social and political orders or possibilities, that they've become stupid. And they would say that there's a couple different versions of this. One is because, oh, they're so happy, they're so peaceful, they're so blissful, but they're dumb because they live in these egalitarian societies. So, you can see that in the stages of economic development. They don't have anything to tell us because they're all equally poor or equally dumb. They may be happy, they may be sad, doesn't matter. The other version of that is that people are so stuck in their traditional ways that they obey their chiefs or they obey their elders or they just are robots of tradition, that there's no possibility of thinking about a different political order the way that we do. So again, we didn't concentrate on this part of the chapter because it gets into a lot of intellectual, historical back and forth and revisionism. But this is a key point to this, is that there develops a tradition which says we don't need to take seriously what other people have to say about social life, because they're not even thinking about these kinds of possibilities. They're either in ignorant bliss or they're blindly following tradition.